All right, welcome to the top 10 video for chapter 8 on reproductive technology. The number 8 thing that you need to know about the chapter on reproductive technology is what is in vitro fertilization. In vitro fertilization is when a sperm and an egg are united in a petri dish. So in vitro is literally in glass. The fertilization happens in a glass dish rather than in utero, in a woman's uterus. The process of in vitro fertilization is somewhat complex, but it typically follows these steps. First, ovarian stimulation. Oftentimes a woman takes something to stimulate her ovaries to produce multiple eggs in a cycle rather than just one egg. The second step is egg retrieval. When the eggs are ready, they are extracted with a needle. A physician will go in and insert a needle through the vagina into the ovaries and suction out the eggs from the follicles. And then, once the eggs have been extracted, the next step is fertilization. The highest quality eggs are taken and inseminated, mixed with sperm, and within a few hours, the sperm will penetrate the egg cells, hopefully of at least one or more of the eggs. Then an embryo culture is done. This is where the eggs are left to grow in that culture, and within about 48 hours, each one has about 2 or 4 cells, and in 3 days, about 6 to 10 cells. And then finally, embryo transfer. The embryo is transferred to the uterus to be implanted, and sometimes more than one fertilized egg is implanted to increase the chances of pregnancy. Oftentimes, even outside of the process of IVF, when a sperm penetrates an egg and gets to the stage of insemination or fertilization, pregnancy still doesn't occur because that set of cells never implants itself in the lining of the uterus. There are lots of different ways that step 5 happens. IVF is one of the primary ways. There are also things like IUI, intrauterine insemination, but IVF is a fairly common approach. Some of the main concerns about IVF is the cost. It costs, on average, about $12,000 per cycle. And it's pretty common for a woman or a couple to go through multiple cycles before they have a successful pregnancy. So the cost is really, really high. It's also stressful. It can be really hard to go through this process, really emotional, to go through the process, spend all of the money, go through the tests and the doctor's visits. And there are many, many doctor's visits that are involved in this. And this can be really stressful without knowing whether or not you'll ever succeed. There are also side effects for the woman. Women often take, in addition to the stimulants to stimulate the ovaries, women often have to take certain kinds of hormones or other medications and have other procedures to help increase the chances of becoming pregnant. There may also be some side effects for the fetus, and the rates of multiple pregnancy increase with IVF. The number of multiple births, twins, triplets, and so on is at an increased rate for people who do IVF. Number 7, what is cryopreservation? Cryopreservation is when embryos are frozen for their possible future use. A lot of folks do this because of the difficulty of harvesting the eggs and going through that procedure. So if they are able to produce multiple embryos, they can be frozen for later use. There are reasons beyond infertility that someone might do this. Women who have cancer, for example, and need to go through chemotherapy, they have the option of going through this process and then cryopreserving embryos for later pregnancies. Some of the main concerns with cryopreservation are that it may be less likely to result in birth once an embryo has been frozen. There's also concern that because there are so many embryos being cryopreserved, This means that there are millions and millions of unused embryos at any given time. And further, it's not clear what to do with those embryos. A lot of times, couples go their separate ways, they divorce, they change their mind, and there really are no legal standards yet for how to deal with this, so it's not clear morally either whether frozen embryos should be donated, whether they should be destroyed, and what the moral implications are that come along with those kinds of choices. The number 6 thing that you should know about reproductive technology is what are some of the major arguments against in vitro fertilization. Some of the main arguments that have been given against the use of IVF are that there is a potential for an increased rate of birth defects. However, it's not clear, we don't have strong, clear evidence yet about the increased risk for birth defects using IVF. Some argue that IVF undermines the value of our offspring. This is kind of a strange argument, as if people who would go through that much trouble to have children are undermining the value we put on having children. I think if anything, it's very likely the contrary. Another argument is that it's contrary to the unity of marriage. I'm just gonna be honest here. I don't even know where to go with that. But the idea here is this is a very conservative argument about the unity of marriage and what marriage is for, that marriage is for reproduction and IVF changes the sort of the role and the unity of the institution of marriage in some way. And finally, there are arguments that IVF changes the family structure. Some argue that although IVF increases women's reproductive choices, this is a bad thing since it reinforces the kind of coercive or normalized or policed idea that women should be mothers. So this is this kind of pronatalist tendency or pronatalist stereotype about women. So although the choices may be increased for women, at the same time it may reinforce the idea that women should be mothers. Number 5, what are some arguments in support of IVF? Well, obviously IVF increases people's autonomy by offering them choices where their choices are limited, particularly for couples who are infertile. So there's a kind of procreative liberty or freedom or widening of choices that comes along with this. It also requires us to respect individual rights and allows for people to make choices about their lives and their families that they might not otherwise be able to make. Number 4, what is surrogacy? Surrogacy is when a woman gestates a fetus for another person or another couple. There are 2 primary kinds of surrogacy, traditional surrogacy and gestational surrogacy. In traditional surrogacy, either the male partner or a sperm donor gives sperm that is used to inseminate the surrogate mother's egg. In traditional surrogacy, then, the fetus is genetically related to the surrogate mother and whoever donates the sperm. In gestational surrogacy, on the other hand, an embryo is donated. So usually the couple or some combination of one of the couple's sperm or eggs along with a donor sperm or egg is used to artificially inseminate the surrogate who will carry the embryo for the couple. So as you can see, this means that the relationships among the couple and the surrogate become complicated. There can be biological parents or genetic parents. There can be a gestational parent, the person who carries the fetus, and social parents, the people intended to be the caretakers of the future child. Remember that we're concerned here with making moral arguments about surrogacy, but it is interesting to note that the laws about surrogacy vary among states. There is no consensus yet about how surrogates should be treated, about how social parents or biological parents should be treated. Some states have completely outlawed surrogacy. Other states have placed various restrictions on enforcing surrogacy contracts. Number 3, what are some common conflicts with surrogacy? Some of the major conflicts that can happen in surrogacy cases are conflicts with the various parties' autonomy. Sometimes the choices that the surrogate and the parents make can come into conflict, and it's not clear whose autonomy ought to be respected in a given case. There's also possible harm to children when these kinds of things become big legal battles. Oftentimes this can cause harm to the children in the long run, and also harm to families and harm to women, opening up women to possible harm by allowing them to be surrogates for other women or other couples. So one example of this that your book discusses is the case of Baby M. So in the case of Baby M, Mary Beth Whitehead agreed to be a surrogate for this couple. She was to be paid $10,000, and she consented to being artificially inseminated with sperm and carrying the baby to term. The baby, named Melissa by the Stearns, the intended social parents who hired the surrogate mother, Mary Beth Whitehead, was born in 1986. But during the surrogacy process, Mrs. Whitehead had a change of heart. She declared that she would not hand the baby over, and she fled the state, went to Florida, I think, and the Stearns took her to court in New Jersey. The judge in New Jersey ruled that the surrogacy contract was binding and that Marion Whitehead had to hand over Baby M to the Stearns. However, Mary Beth Whitehead appealed with the New Jersey Supreme Court, and she won. The Supreme Court ruled that the surrogacy contract was actually invalid and declared that Whitehead was the actual mother of the child. The court did say, though, that in the best interest of the child, Baby M should live with the Stearns and Whitehead should have visitation rights. There are several cases like this that illustrate the kinds of issues that come up with surrogacy and the need for better policies, better laws, and better moral arguments about the use of surrogates. Number 2, what is the major argument against surrogacy? The main argument against surrogacy is that surrogacy is a form of baby selling. So some will argue that because folks like the Stearns, for example, are paying $10,000 to have another woman carry their baby, that this is a form of baby selling. And that any type of baby selling is not only immoral and should be illegal, it's downright inhumane. However, many will respond to this by saying a surrogate actually surrenders her rights as a parent, and so she's not selling her rights to a parental relationship. She's not selling her rights to a parental relationship. She's not selling her baby. So it's not baby selling. That the surrogate is merely offering the use of her body. It's like a service in order to help couples have their own child. Since IVF is not an option for some women if they're not able to carry a baby. So whether or not they are able to produce an egg is one issue, but another issue is whether or not they can actually carry a baby to term. Moreover, some argue that surrogacy is a socially valuable service. It doesn't have to be motivated by altruism on the side of the surrogate woman, nor does it have to be unpaid. It's simply a social service that we need to help some couples have children. One option is conceiving of surrogacy as a kind of prenatal adoption. We could see this as a form of adoption that happens before the child is born. The number one thing that you should know about reproductive technology is what is reproductive cloning. Reproductive cloning has actually been going on for quite a while now. Maybe you've heard about some of the animals that have been cloned, like Dolly the sheep, for example, who I believe was the first animal clone, Tetra the rhesus monkey, who was the first primate. The aim of reproductive cloning is the live birth of an individual. So this is different from research cloning, therapeutic cloning, where cells are being cloned to help improve someone's health. Reproductive cloning, though, is actually cloning some individual of a species in order to bring about the live birth of a cloned copy of that individual. This is a really, really neat process. Cloning happens through somatic cell nuclear transfer, which works by following these steps. First, the nucleus is extracted from an egg cell. So you take an egg cell, take out the nucleus, and then you replace that nucleus with the somatic cell of the individual to be cloned. So when Dolly was cloned, for example, they took an egg cell, and then they took out the nucleus of the egg cell, and then they took a somatic cell of the individual sheep, and they took the nucleus of that cell into the egg nucleus. They would then stimulate the egg cell to start cell division, and then transfer that cloned cell to a host uterus. And what you have now is a cell with the DNA of the individual being cloned. So because the DNA resides in the nucleus, cloning an individual allows another individual to have the exact DNA, which of course through typical reproduction doesn't happen because you have an egg and a sperm with two distinct sets of DNA, which will result in a new and unique set of DNA. However, in somatic cell nuclear transfer, you are making a copy of an already existing set of DNA. The main argument against human cloning is that it will result in high rates of birth defects, and so this would be morally problematic. It would be morally wrong to clone human beings because of the high risk of birth defects. And we did see this elevated risk in cloning animals. And so we would want to ask things like, should people have reproductive or procreative freedom to clone? Is this the kind of thing that people should have the choice to do? Or does human cloning violate the clone's right, the initial individual's right, to a unique genetic identity? And of course there's the claim that cloning is unnatural. I'm not sure how much water that holds. We do a lot of things that are unnatural in medicine. If what natural means is occurs naturally in nature without human intervention, most medicine is unnatural in that sense. But we still are left with the moral question of whether or not human cloning is a good idea. So these are the basics from chapter 8. We will look into some of these topics in greater detail in the upcoming additional readings.